Anyway, that's it for this evening. I do want to mention that we do have a brochure for those people that are not familiar with what we do in Apologetics Forum. So there's one on the back table, and all the flyers for the meetings coming up, there are flyers on the back table as well. And if you are not on our mailing list and want to be, there's a sign-up sheet on the back table. Just add your name and your emailing address, and you'll be informed of all the meetings we have coming up. And the other one I want to show is there's a DVD that CMI put out, Creation Ministries International. It's called Fallout, and it explains why our youth are falling away from the faith after they leave home and go to college. Why? Why does that happen? And this one is a very good explanation for that. So I've got a few on the back table. Feel free to pick that up as well. So with that, let me introduce Marcus. Marcus has been, he's well-degreed, as you can see. He's got 3 different degrees in related earth sciences and paleontology and environmental science. And so he's been a student of geology and paleontology for a long time. He was a professor at Liberty University back east, Christian University, and I think 16, 17 years. And in the meantime, and at the end of his term there, he founded a new company called Cornerstone Educational Supply Company. And he has some samples that he'll explain later on as he comes up. So the topic he's going to speak on is the different views that people hold about origins. And that's what his talk on Saturday morning is about, Adam and origin of humans. But he's going to do a high-level discussion of the different views. We are a young Earth organization, but there are related views like old Earth. Some people believe in old Earth, and there are even some people that believe in theistic evolution and intelligent design. How do we differentiate about all that? How do they relate to young Earth? So Marcus will come up and explain that to us. So Marcus, let's give him a hand.
To you all, so thank you very much for graciously hosting me this evening. This talk, Who Believes What, has roots that go back more than 20 years. When I was a graduate student at the University of Rhode Island, I was working on a paleontology program, but one of the things that I've always had was a penchant for more philosophical perspectives on science. Why do we consider science valuable? What are the rules through which we decide to do science? Are those rules hard and fast? Are they flexible? Can we muscle in different ideas? And one of the things that was going on in the early 2000s, many of you may remember, was there were court cases in Pennsylvania. The Dover case was a big deal where intelligent design was made an available option in a library, and it caused a big federal court case. A few years before that, the state of Kansas had stricken evolution and Big Bang cosmology from the state test, not necessarily from teaching it entirely, but they took it away from the state standardized test, caused an uproar. I was in next door South Dakota. It was ugly. There was a lot of interest and a lot of passion and a lot of anger and a lot of other stuff that went around with this. And many of you may remember that there was just a lot of fighting over this topic at that time. And that was the time of my graduate studies. When I was an undergraduate, there were no fights. I got through just fine. Then there were fights in grad school, and things weren't so easy. One of the classes I got to take when I was at the University of Rhode Island was a class in the philosophy of science. You don't usually do that. Most scientists just grind out all their science classes. But I was like, no, I got a philosophy of science. Can I take this? It's actually about evolution. It's about the problem of what we call induction, which is making a generalization from a limited set of data, which is what we do all the time in science. We make observations, and then from that we create a hypothesis that kind of generalizes those things, but it turns out that none of that is logically valid. None of it, ever. And that's because induction is different from deduction, and deduction is about logic rules. Induction is not. So we have this problem about, can we ever justify what we do in science? So as part of that, in this class, that was kind of a theme that we were going through. I wanted to help people understand that there were quite a few different viewpoints, and Heinz just mentioned a bunch of them. We have young Earth creation, old Earth creation, theistic evolution, or some theistic evolutionists prefer to be called evolutionary creationists. We have folks who refer to themselves as part of an intelligent design community, and I was involved with that myself. In fact, having just shown that video from ICR, that graph with the Cambrian explosion and a couple of things down below and everything, basically I made that graph with intelligent design people back in 2002. So I see that and I kind of chuckle. It's like, oh, all right. Maybe I can get a vote of royalty on that. No, it's fine. It's fine, right? Nobody owns the data. And of course, we have things like naturalistic and materialist evolution. Within the United States, these are the dominant options that seem to be out on the table, right? This might look different if we were in India or if we were in Pakistan or if we were in some other country. But here in the United States, these are the dominant perspectives that are out there. But on the other hand, at that time of the 90s and the early 2000s, there were also terms being tossed around like, this is the new creationism, often labeled for intelligent design. Somewhat ironically, this is a term that is now much more often being applied to some young Earth creationists with a new approach to young Earth creationism, not different in some ways, but a different way of bringing it together. Oops, wrong direction. Neo-creationist, another one that has been used both for young Earth creationists and intelligent design people. Like, what is a neo-creationist? Is it a creationist that realizes that they're in the Matrix? I don't know. That's the first time I tried that joke. We'll see how it works. Creationism in disguise. If you were an intelligent design advocate, you were often called this sort of name, or just intelligent design creationism. And I looked at these terms, and I didn't like them because they weren't accurate, and they weren't precise, and they weren't helping the discussion. Instead, they were frequently used by critics of design or critics of creationism and try to blur the boundaries. In the 1990s and 2000s, young Earth creationists had largely been defeated in a whole bunch of court cases, and so if you can tar and feather intelligent design with creationism on it, then you know who you're dealing with. You're just dealing with those people again. So, these views were used to confuse and dismiss. Who would use terms like that? Who would make these terms up? Well, people who didn't like creationists or other design-based kinds of perspectives. But I don't like it when the waters are muddied. I like my definitions clean. It's just a lot simpler that way, and it's more accurate. As a biologist and a paleontologist, one of the things that we do is when we find a new fossil, we define and describe a new species. That's a very rigorous thing to do. It's not willy-nilly. You don't just find a fossil and say, it looks a little new, I'm going to call it something. There's a procedure. There's a way of doing this that is very detailed so that you have a definition for what this thing is. I want there to be good definitions for what ideas are as well. So for an example of one of these, and it's a little hard to read here, but it was a little hard to read even in the paper because it was just a bad image, but this was what Eugenie Scott called the creation-evolution continuum. She first published this in, I think, 1999, maybe a little bit earlier in one of their newsletters, but it showed up in one of her books. You may remember the name Eugenie Scott if you watched the movie Expelled back when that came out in 2008. She didn't come across very well in that movie. She was jokey, nasty, pejorative, just, kind of a grouch. And that's pretty fitting. I've met Jeannie. She's not very nice. So she's got this idea that you can put all the different viewpoints of creation and evolution on this continuum, a sliding scale between creation and evolution. And she talks about how this is a singular source of classification. It really is all based on how literal you take the Bible. The more literal you take the Bible, the further up you go, and the less literal you take the Bible, the further down the slide you end up. So she considered that the end members of these things would represent the pure forms of creation and the pure forms of evolution. And so the pure form of creation, in her view, is a flat earther. Now, it's important for me to point out here that 25 years ago, there were no flat earthers. This is a new internet phenomenon where it kind of bubbled back up to the surface. But at least in 1999, there were none. There hadn't been any flat earthers for decades and decades and decades. It's just you couldn't find anyone. So her putting that up there was actually just really a nasty little dig. But if you took the Bible a little less literally, but still like hyper literally, you would be a geocentrist. Young earthers were just a little bit less than the geocentrists in their literal, and you just went down the line through various types of old earth creationists to your evolutionary creationists and your theistic evolutionists, and then the pure evolutionists were the agnostics and atheists that Jeannie happened to be. This is all very convenient and quite wrong. So we have this literal interpretation of the Bible. Here's a much worse looking image from a geologist by the name of Donald Wise. He taught at University of Massachusetts, Amherst. But it's basically the same, except for Donald Wise is more of a practicing scientist, so his graph has got 2 axes. So yeah, we've got to be doing science. We got to have graphs and axes and labels for them, right? So he actually explicitly says the Bible's on one axis and science is on the other. The Bible is taken literally up at the top. The Bible is not accepted as evidence. And then the other one, we've got the deity can control anything versus there is no deity. And he doesn't start with the geocentrists and the flat earthers. He just starts with the young earth creationists and moves his way down through a whole bunch of stuff until you get to evolution all the way. Now, I'll point out this was an illustration that was published in a geology education journal. Evolution all the way is a rather colloquial way of describing things to your fellow academics, in my opinion. And the whole article was all against flood geology and against young earth creationism, but this was his idea of how to organize all these different people. And so you can see up over here that we've got progressive, constant, minor, special creation over geologic time, but no evolution. That would be something like Hugh Ross, no relation, but Hugh Ross of Reasons to Believe is an old earth creationist, and he thinks that God was directly creating species over several billion years of earth history. So he is a creationist. He believes God was doing the creation. He also believes that God created the universe using the Big Bang. And he's a passionate Christian and evangelist for the Christian faith. He is my brother in the Lord. We've had 3 debates. The last one was actually on our campus at Liberty University just this February. And he and I can get along and talk with one another and be cordial and civil and disagree. And that's good to be able to model to students, especially in a society right now where cordial discussion and disagreement don't happen very often. It's better to be able to show people that it can, especially among the church. Especially among the church. There are times when you have to draw a line and say, after this is heresy, but that's not one of the places, right? But Donald Wise is an agnostic or an atheist himself, and so this is likewise a very convenient sort of illustration. But he's got the science and Bible axes here, indicating that in his mind, the Bible and science are 2 things that are not the same, right? Your X and your Y axes always have to be independent of one another, and your graph shows how they're connected through some relationship, but the axes themselves are separate. So science and the Bible are different, right? So this is his belief spectrum, published just 2 years after Jeannie Scott's. He considers it a sliding scale, so very similar to Jeannie, and the Bible and the science axes are up there. So I looked at these sorts of things as a graduate student. I'm like, this is honestly not helpful. And we've got 3 difficulties here. We have a difficulty of what we call demarcation. That philosophy of science class that I was taking was also a lot about this. How do you tell what is science and what is not science? Can you draw a line down somewhere and say, this is where you cross the boundary? And demarcation isn't something that we just talk about in science. It can mean all sorts of different things, wherever we have to draw a line between stuff. Can it be done? If so, how? What arguments do you use? So in this case, Bible and the science are demarcated as different things. This idea of a literal interpretation of a classification method is problematic, and so is the assumption of some kind of theological uniformity that links these different perspectives. It's assumed that everybody is either some form of Christian or agnostic atheist, and it ignores the fact that there are other theological perspectives out there that some of these people actually fit into. So we want to avoid these types of problems. So I'm going to simplify and just talk off of Jeannie's, because we can always, of course, just put our axes on there of Bible and science, because that's what she's doing too. So this assumes that there is a science and non-science distinction, a very hard one that puts the Bible not in science, and science is a different thing, which You also see in the way that they talk about how creationists or students, as they're thinking about in classes, will either accept or reject certain kinds of science because they accept or reject certain biblical principles or ideas or concepts. So there's this constant separation between the two. They might talk about how you could accommodate, in some way, science to different biblical interpretations. And the idea that materialist evolutionists, way down at the very bottom, Jeannie calls a non-religious position. Well, sort of, except for it still makes religious claims. Atheism makes very clear religious claims. There is no God. That is not a scientific claim. You can't test it. Not by science. And that's why courts in the United States have consistently recognized atheism as actually a religion. It's just a religion that doesn't require you to practice anything in particular. But it is a religious claim. Materialist evolutionist, that term means you believe that the entire universe, that all that there is made up of matter and energy. The material world is all there is. There's nothing outside, nothing beyond it. So if the Bible is not science, it can't guide research, it can't provide hypotheses that we can test, and it can't be evaluated by science at all. We can't ask whether or not science corroborates or doesn't the Bible, which is interesting because what you'll find with folks that might talk about things in the way that Jeannie and Don Wise did is that they're going to say two things. They're going to say that science and the Bible, they're not the same thing. Bible's different. Your religious views are separate from scientific views. But they'll also say that certain scientific discoveries and facts disprove the Bible. Well, if you decided that the Bible cannot be touched by science, then guess what? It can't be touched by science. So you can't simultaneously say that the Bible stands outside of science entirely and say that science disproves the Bible. You got to pick one or the other. Either way, you have options to argue with Christians, but you can't pick both. And so if you're talking with somebody and they do that, you can say, wait a minute. No. Does the Bible make claims that can be evaluated by science or does it not? If it doesn't, then it's pure emotional faith, spiritual faith sort of stuff, and you can't say anything about the contents of the Bible from science. But if you want to go the other road, now we get to talk about evidence. Now we get to argue about whether or not evidence is supportive or not to a particular claim for or against the Bible. But there's so many historical counterexamples to these statements. So, for example, Carl von Linné. Any of you heard that name before? Carolus Linnaeus, as his Latin version is. Yes, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. It was said at the time, God creates, but Linné classifies. That was actually a phrase at the day, because Linné was obsessed with classifying the work of God. And he used the word species to describe the things that he thought were the created kinds, because in Latin, the word for kind is species. When you read Genesis in Latin, God creates each species according to its species. The animals according to their kinds, I should say, right? So this is part of the problem in creationism, actually, why we have this kind of ball and chain that's dragged around that God created every species separately. It's because Linné used this word that was a biblical word, and he applied it to a scientific concept. And eventually, Linné realized that the species, there were a bunch of species, especially in plants, he was a specialist in plants, that could hybridize. And he's like, wait a minute, but if they're different kinds, how can they hybridize? And so Linné dropped the idea of species fixity in his own lifetime and said maybe the created kind is actually the genus. But unfortunately, the die was kind of cast, and we've been mangling with this thing ever since. So modern young earth creationists do not think that the species is the created kind. But thanks to Latin, we got this little problem. But anyway, Linné, Paley, William Paley, the famous watchmaker example of finding a watch and inferring that there is a watchmaker, and then making the analogy that when I see beautiful design in nature, it implies that there is a designer to that nature. That was science of the day. Charles Darwin carried a copy of Linné's book, Natural Theology, with him on the voyage of the Beagle. He read it in college. He was very impressed by Paley's logic. And if you read Origin with Paley in mind, you start to understand that what Darwin is doing is he is trying to answer Paley's argument. Most of Origin is oriented with Paley completely in the foreground. And we don't know that because we are not part of that society. We're not part of that intellectual milieu that Darwin was in, trying to find a way to explain the design without the direct action of a designer. Newton, of course, writing in Principia, talks about how the heavenly bodies are moving through this force that he infers called gravity. But one of the things that Newton very clearly said is that gravity could explain the motions of the heavens, but it could not explain how they started off that way. And that was the work of God. Now, if Newton's Principia does not count as science, there is nothing that counts as science. Nothing. It's Principia. I mean, what do you do? He invented calculus so he could explain the world better. He did, yeah. And he waited 5 years before publishing it because he didn't think anybody would believe him. It was one of his friends. It's like, you've got to write this down. And Darwin, again, thinking about Darwin as a response to Paley, many of Darwin's arguments are against the creationists of his day, who actually did start holding to species fixity for other bad reasons. It wasn't because of Linné. It was for other things. But nonetheless, a lot of Darwin's arguments are actually theological, philosophical, moral and ethical arguments. Yes, he has a lot of data. And to be honest, if you read The Origin of Species, it's, first off, as an old pastor of mine used to say, dry as cracker juice. It's boring. But that was exceptionally good Victorian science. Darwin's book is patient and methodical in the documentation of observations. It is Baconian science at its best. I don't like his inferences. I think that he swung too far, but he saw things that were correct. He saw things like species fixity doesn't work. It's not right. And by that time, a lot of people in Victorian England and France and Germany felt that God created every single species separately because that's the only way they could have been perfectly fitted to their environment. And Darwin looks at it and says, that's not right. But unfortunately, he swung too far on the pendulum and said, not only can species can change immeasurably. There's no boundaries. But Darwin's writing would not qualify as science in some versions of this because of the way that he wrote and about the topics that he wrote. Another problem here, this literal criterion of how literal you take the Bible. This is going to put you somewhere on the sliding scale. So this, first off, theologically, the term literal, it's a tricky one. I go to a bunch of theology meetings now because my sister is an Old Testament theologian. She teaches at Liberty University. She's a Hebraist, an Old Testament scholar, and which is a great benefit to me because I get to ask her all sorts of questions about what the Hebrew is doing in Genesis and stuff like that. And she's like, well, let me pull out my Bible, and she's reading from this direction. You're like, what? Whoa, okay, yeah, she knows. But if you ask a group of theologians, what does it mean to read the Bible literally, you're going to get a lot of answers. And they're also going to not like being pushed into answering that because it's a loaded term, really loaded term. So for example, in Jeannie Scott's approach, the most literal member here is a flat earther because, the Bible says the earth is flat somewhere maybe. We'll get to that. Let's just say, for example, let's say that you've got a person who is saying the earth is flat because in the book of Revelation, it says that John saw that there were 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the wind, holding the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth. Sounds to me like the earth is a big square, rectangle at least, right? Okay, so they're saying, I'm holding the Bible most literally because I believe this word for word. There's 4 angels, 4 corners, 4 winds. You can't have 4 corners on a globe, Dr. Ross. Game, set, match. Well, a young earther and an old earth creationist who are further down on this list, taking the Bible apparently less literally, might say, you know what? You seem to be missing something that we call context. Because a few verses before, John says, I was caught up in a vision, And as soon as the Bible says something like a vision, we know that we're not talking about exact representation of what's happening on earth. He's being shown something. You want a fun vision? Read Ezekiel. You want a scary vision? Read Ezekiel again, right? It's like, oh, this is really, really weird. And can you imagine Ezekiel's got to come back down and say what he saw? Just like wheels and eyes within more wheels and eyes. And everybody's like, what? Did you eat that mushroom? I'm like, no! But I can't explain it to you any other way. I've got to tell you sort of like what I saw, right? So John's seeing a vision. And any good scholar of the Bible is going to go, woo, hold on, visions, we got to be really careful about the way that these are describing things. A lot of figurative language. So if flat earth ignores style and context, and young earth creationists and old earth creationists might point out actually contradictory components, mentioning that there is another passage in the Bible that talks about the circle of the earth. Okay, so is the earth a circle or a square? Well, maybe that doesn't work so well, right? Does that mean that we have to move flat earth down the scale? This is where things got fun. I showed this presentation for the very first time to a group of geologists at an annual geology convention. Jeannie Scott was in the audience, sitting right about there, as a matter of fact. That was fun. The session chair did say, like, remember, Jeannie's going to be here, so you got to be nice. I'm like, I'm going to be nice, but I'm going to be very pointed in this, critique here. And all the geologists in the room, like, there's me and one other young earth creationist, Dr. Kurt Wise. We're the only creationists in there. So this room is packed. We've got 150 geologists and educators here. And I show them this. What do we have to do if we take the young earth, the flat earthers, and we realize that they are not taking the Bible as literally as they should, because to take the Bible literally means that you have to take its genre and its style and context in consideration. If you don't do that, you're actually not reading literal. If you're reading Jesus' parable of the talents as a literal story that happened, you're making a mistake, because he's telling you a literal story, not a story of literal events. Well, that would mean that we'd have to move the flat earthers down somewhere. Where? By intelligent design? By the evolutionary creationists or the theistic evolutionists? Wait a minute, those are the reasonable people. Those are the smart people who actually know that the world is old and God, and if there is God, he used evolution or whatever, right? All of a sudden, we're putting the flat earth people on the scale next to the people who are in the audience going, oh, they don't go next to me. That's for sure. And I'm like, exactly, right? There's a problem here. And it was great to see a whole bunch of geologists chuckle and see Eugenie Scott sit there and go, Little shade and fraud. So if we have a disagreement about what the word literal means, then that means that this literal criterion is not going to work, because it requires certain kinds of agreement about what this is. And if we don't have that, sorry. This is just Jeannie's view of what a literal approach to the Bible is, and I shouldn't probably trust that very much, since she doesn't crack the book open. Another problem, non-uniform theology. Intelligent design, as Jeannie would use the term intelligent design creationism, that was one of her favorites, she categorized intelligent design as a form of old earth creation, right? So there it is in italics underneath old earth creation that's in standard font. So you've got gap creationism, day age, progressive creationism, and intelligent design. Now, I honestly think it's understandable that she would do this, because many of the people in the intelligent design community are old earth creationists of some form. And yet, I was a member of the Discovery Institute, and I was a young earth creationist. So was Paul Nelson. Some of the other people were more like theistic evolutionists, like Michael Behe. He did believe that God was doing purposeful design, but he also thought God was doing purposeful design through universal ancestry, like evolution. So if all of us are in the intelligent design community, then you can't just say that they're old earth creationists, because I'm not one. And that was one of the motivators for me to go into this kind of study. So there's other types of Christian positions that are represented. Myself and John Mark Reynolds and Paul Nelson for young earth creationists. Michael Behe is more or less a theistic evolutionist of some kind, but he thinks that God has a very strong influence of what's going on, rather than just a puppeteer kind of behind the scenes. you're also then categorizing intelligent design as a specifically Christian position by putting it under old age creation. But there are non-Christians involved in the intelligent design community. David Berlinski was Jewish, and very secular Jewish at that, Jewish by ancestry more than by religious conviction. Michael Denton, many of you might know his books. He's a Neoplatonist. He's basically a pantheist. He believes that God and the universe are a singular entity, and God manifests himself through the physical forms of the world around us. And the designs that we see are reflections of a God that is part of the universe. That doesn't sound to me like Christian theism. That sounds like paganism. And it is. So let's call a spade a spade. He believes in a Neoplatonist view, he cannot be an old earth creationist, because that would be someone like Hugh Ross. That would be something like the old gap theory of the Schofield Bible. It's not him. There are even atheists and agnostics that are part of the intelligent design community, and the most interesting one, especially at the time when I first gave this talk, was this weird group called the Raelian cult. This was a group of people led by some guy in France who claimed that he had been contacted by aliens. Their leader was Rael. And Rael and his group of aliens, they were the El. They were God, Elohim. Right? So we're way off in cult world now, right? I mean, way, way out. But the Raelian cult actually very frequently pointed to intelligent design literature and said, we agree because we believe, because we were told that the aliens actually planted human life on this planet. We were designed by them as a biological experiment. So they are actually intelligent design advocates that nobody wanted at the party, but they were intelligent design advocates and made intelligent design arguments about biology. Where do they fit on this? Well, they were actually atheists because they believed that there was no real God. There were only these super intelligent aliens that came in. Other than that, they were atheists. It's like, okay, so none of this works. You can't use the Bible and the literal interpretation of the Bible as a way to categorize these people because it's just too diverse. What about, well, I mean, all three of these, right? All three of these fail. We can't demarcate so easily between science and the Bible. We can't use literal as an interpretation, and we can't assume that everybody is on some either Christian or agnostic view, right? This isn't 1820s America where you're either, some form of Christian theist into a Unitarian and into, I'm not going to say atheist because I'm going to get tarred and feathered. But that's ancient history here. So we needed a different way. I needed to be able to explain to people better how someone like me, as a young earth creationist, could fit in the intelligent design community with some comfort amongst other people who weren't like me, who weren't young earth creationists. So we have to avoid these kind of philosophical pitfalls that are just going to end up making us look kind of silly or maybe historically uninformed. We have to rely on more robust methods. So we got to avoid this idea of using just like one character. In biology, we never use one character. Define a bird. It has wings. Bugs are birds, right? You run into a big problem if you say this one thing is what defines this entire group. So biologically, this never works. So we have to bring something like that to the table. We need to be able to say, no, we gotta narrow our focus when we start talking about different groups and see where they're similar and see where they're different. And so you have to use what I would say in science, multiple characters. This is where the paleontologist in me starts coming out. I'm like, all right, we're going to classify things like a paleontologist. How are we going to do this? We have to ask these different perspectives questions and find out what their answers are, and then use those answers to drive forward for definitions. That's the way to do it. And it's going to result in what we might call a nested hierarchy. So hierarchy, right, you've got things on the top and things on the bottom. A nested one means Russian dolls, cups and cups and cups and boxes and things like that. You're going to stick things into bins that match, and you're going to put in things in different bins when they really don't match. And so what I did is I had to ask each of these perspectives, if you will, some questions, and find out from the answers that they gave me what what they might say about themselves. So the questions that I would ask, and it's important here to recognize you have to listen. If I want to know what an old earth creationist thinks about things, I need to read them, like Hugh Ross, for example, and I've read a lot of Hugh Ross's stuff. You got to do debate prep, right? I got to be ready to debate him. And by the way, on Ross versus Ross, Ross won by a landslide. It wasn't even close. I have to read Hugh Ross, and I have to also do something that is something we don't like to do. You have to read them charitably. You have to read them to understand what they are saying and why they're saying it. And as much as I do put my critical notes in the books of people whom I disagree, I also have to try to put myself into the world that they are in so I can understand it better. If you can do that, you have reached a level of critical thinking that is far advanced from others. And that was something that my training as a paleontologist really taught me. Because all the schools that I went to, as Heinz kindly put up on the board, I went to Penn State University for my undergraduate. I went to the South Dakota School of Mines and Tech for my master's. I went to the University of Rhode Island for my Ph.D. Those are not Christian schools. I didn't go to Christian schools for my high school or elementary school. I never spent a single day in a Christian college or school until I was teaching behind a lectern at Liberty University. My entire history was spent in systems that did not agree with my view of the world and its history. And so what do you do when you're in that situation? Do you sit in every single class with your hand up and say, but what about? Not if you want some friends, right? Not if you don't want to spend a lot of time in the principal's office. You can't be a jerk. You can be, but there'll be consequences. So what I had to do is, if I wanted to be the best creationist I could be, I had to become the best evolutionist I could be. I had to immerse myself in evolutionary biology, in old age geology, evolutionary paleontology, because the first thing that anybody is going to think about you when you say you're a young earth creationist is that you're a young earth creationist because you're ignorant. Right? Because there's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of scientists out there, and they say the earth is ancient and biological evolution is true. And you're one person going to tell me that it isn't? Boy, you must not know what's going on. And honestly, that's a fair point. When you find yourself in that kind of small minority, you do have to ask yourself, am I crazy? And the answer could be yes or no. You got to be honest with yourself. So in order to become the best creationist I could be, I had to become the best evolutionist I could be. It means you read Dawkins. It means you read Gould. It means that you read the papers in the science journals that Gould and Dawkins are talking about when they write their popular level books. You go down and down and down deep into the rabbit hole. And you have to come back and remind yourself of where you are and what you're doing and why you're doing it. I didn't get a Ph.D. in geology so that I could destroy evolution. That wasn't my goal. I got a Ph.D. in geology because I love fossils, I love God's world, and I want to understand it better. Those are different things. If you go into a discipline because you're there in order to destroy something else, you will not be a happy camper. That's not the sort of thing that God has intended us to be. We are to yearn for those things that are good and not to keep our focus on those things that are bad. At times, there are times to go to war, right? The world is full of times in which you must stand up to those things that are wrong. But most of the time, the thing that animates you must be the good. And if there is a truth out there that my secular colleagues are missing, I need to try to find it. And so my approach to creationism is not so much to try and show that evolution is wrong, but that creationism is right and better, or at least could be better than anything that they have. Because in the end, most scientists are pragmatists. They want to use things that work. They're not writing papers because they want to destroy Christianity. I've lived with them. It's not the way they are. There's a few jerks. There's a few jerks. But everybody thinks they're jerks. And use other words that I won't say politely in a church. So you have to ask these questions of these different positions, and you have to listen to them to hear their answers. And once you do that, you might ask questions like, do you believe that there is design in nature? Yes or no? Do you think that that design can be detected using the means of science? Yes or no? Is life continuous or is life discontinuous? Yes or no? How old do you think the Earth or the universe are? And I had a series of about 7 or 8 of these questions that I was asking each of the positions. And when I did that, I was then able to take those. I coded, this was the fun part of it, is I coded it as if I was coding the physical characters of animals with little ones and zeros and running them through a program to create an evolutionary tree. And this is when the entire audience of 150 geologists started really chuckling because they looked at that and went, I get it. I know what you just did. You just made what we call a cladogram of origins positions. And now I think I get it. Okay, so the materialist evolutionist is what we would call the outgroup. They're the one that is actually the most different from all the others in this setup, because when it comes to the question of is there any design does life have a purpose? They're going to say, well, no. Life's purpose is proximal to life. My life's purpose is to live and do. But is there a real purpose to the universe? And no, there isn't. Everybody else says yes. And so this is a big first distinction. It's a big separation. So that even though these groups over here are physically close to this, they're actually all closer to the ones over to this side. Because before you can join materialist evolutionists, you've got to come down to this linkage point with everybody off to the right. So, do you think that there is design that the universe actually evinces some kind of design, either intuitively or scientific? Would you believe that there's design to the universe? If you say yes, then you're going to keep going. Everybody there says that there is design in the universe. Is it detectable by science? If the answer is no, you go up the line into what I called weak deistic evolution or weak theistic evolution. Now, I'm not saying that from a theological standpoint. I'm saying that from a standpoint of how strong is your design claim. If you think design is something that you just intuitively know, then you are part of the weak design group. If you think design is detectable by science, then you're going to see that there's some strong deistic evolution and strong theistic evolution there because the design is real and we can detect it using science. So the claims about that design are going to be far stronger than they are for others. This is interesting then, because you can have somebody who is theologically a theistic evolutionist. They believe that God exists and used evolution to create, but they think that our understanding and our knowledge of that design is something that is spiritual and emotional and aesthetic, versus another theistic evolutionist who might be sitting right next to them in the pew and says, well, I think that design in the universe actually can be identified in some scientific way. And they are very far apart from one another on this diagram. Because if it's detectable, well, that actually puts you in the same group as these weird Raelian alien guys. Because they think design exists, is real, and is detectable by science. And in the early 2000s, this helped to make sense of why someone like Michael Behe, a Catholic theistic evolutionist, intelligent design advocate, would be in a knockdown, drag-out debate with Kenneth Miller, a Catholic theistic evolutionist who thought that design was not detectable. These guys are both Catholic theistic evolutionists. They are in the same camp, except when it comes to is design actually detectable? And they're like, yes, no, great, fight. You go, oh, that's really interesting. Now I understand why Michael Behe has more in common with me as a young earth creationist than he does with his fellow Catholic theistic evolutionist who could attend the same exact parish. And it all gets down to what are your answers to these questions. And from this, you could then create definitions that were accurate for each of these groups. So for example, a young earth creationist believes that there is real design in the universe that is detectable, was formed by a non-corporeal being, that is, something that exists outside the universe, God, as opposed to the Raelians. They think the design was aliens inside the universe, right? So a non-physical being that is transcendent outside the universe and is theistic, that is, continues to operate in the world after he created it, and believes in a discontinuous creation of life. Life is created according to kinds. And you can see we're really close now between the young earth and the old earth creationists. What's the only difference between the two of us? The age of the earth. And this explains why young Earth creationists and old Earth creationists fight with each other all the time. It's hard for me, actually, to fight with someone who is a theistic evolutionist who believes that the evidence for design is aesthetic and moral and spiritual but not physical, because we're never in the same churches. We're just not there. They often believe some other things that I don't believe. They might not hold to inerrancy or things like that. And so I'm not rubbing shoulders with them at the family gathering. But instead, we can have people in the same exact church that are old Earth creationists and young Earth creationists. Why? Well, because aside from that, we're down the line Missouri Synod Lutheran. We're down the line Presbyterian, PCEA. We're down the line Independent Fundamental Baptist, whatever it is. But we find that we've got this one little thing that we got some disagreement on. And so what do we spend all of our time fighting about? That one little thing. Why? There's nothing else to fight about. End times. Right, forget it. So this is interesting, and it's helpful now, because what I was trying to help these geologists to understand is that if you're in a class and you have a student who asks a question and shows maybe some interest in the idea that God created the universe in some way, don't think all of a sudden that they're a young Earth creationist simply because they asked a question that, maybe there's design in the universe. Because there's a lot of other perspectives that hold that view. Be careful about that. Don't make assumptions about people believing this or that or the other thing when you have very limited amount of information. And this should help you understand and categorize those students. So if you have to kind of do a mental triage of what do I have to talk with them about, okay, I'm a young Earth creationist. We got a lot of things to talk about, but this other kid over here, he just thinks that God used the Big Bang to create, and after that, God set everything in motion. Well, honestly, he's not going to have that much difference from my materialist evolutionist professor. They might disagree over whether or not God made the Big Bang or not, or maybe if God, maybe if the species were created each time, but they're still not arguing about the age of the Earth. These are big differences that an educator ought to know so that they can talk to a student reasonably and hopefully charitably. So I wrote all of this up and actually published it in that same geological journal that Donald Wise sent his through. The Journal of Geological Education. It was called Who Believes What? Clearing Up Confusion Over Intelligent Design in Young Earth Creationism. There were immediate calls for its removal and scrubbing from the journal because I was known as an intelligent design advocate. It was interesting. Jeannie Scott, she had a couple of phone calls with my advisor. She's not a nice person. She tries to hurt people. Trying to tell my advisor, do you know who you have as a student? Do you know what he's been up to? Do you know what he does? And actually, because I was open with my professor is able to say on the phone, yes, Jeannie. Yeah, well, I didn't know that, but yes, I do know these things about Marcus. Thank you for your concerns. That's a big benefit of being open about being a young Earth creationist or an old Earth creationist or whatever. If you are a Christian who finds yourself in a position where you have significant, substantial differences of opinion with the academic or work area in which you're in, I actually think it's more important that you're open about that. First off, for me, in my experience, is because it built a lot of trust. By telling my undergraduate advisor, by telling my graduate advisor, my Ph.D. advisor that I was a young Earth creationist, they knew what they were getting into, and they had a chance to back out. Because if they weren't going to be the sort of people that could handle having someone like me, then it would be under God's grace that they wouldn't take me as well. Otherwise, it was going to be pretty bad. And I had seen a few other instances where people had been very, very quiet about their perspectives and then came out later as an intelligent design advocate or a young Earth creationist, and the response and the reaction from the people that knew them was very, very bad because they felt betrayed. Whether they should or not, they did. They felt like you lied to us about things. I didn't want that to be something that would characterize my experience. But nonetheless, to the credit of the editor, he's like, nope, we're not going to pull the article. We published an article on similar topics just 4 years before by Donald Wise. This is why I sent it to that journal. And you cite Donald Wise to make sure that the journal knows you're paying attention to the things that are in their own journal. You got to stroke the feathers properly here. But, I know that there was like an editorial meeting about what do we do with this thing. And they decided, we'll keep it, but we won't let anybody write any letters to the editor. We're just going to let it die. We're just going to let it sit. It got published, and it's actually probably one of the most heavily downvoted things that they published, because I told everybody in the intelligent design community, like everybody started using it. It's like, hey, I know schools that would use this in their educational classes. To the glory of God. I mean, it's just a great opportunity there. Now, some other things that we might consider, but I don't want to go over on our time here, and I want to leave plenty of time for us to answer and ask some questions. But I'm going to bring up something else here, a timeline. It's funny, my sister is an Old Testament scholar, and me as a paleontologist, we love timelines. My timelines usually go from bottom to top because geologists think from old to young in a stack of rocks. But most people think in terms of timelines from left to right because, of course, we were English. If you were Hebrew, you'd do your stuff backwards. But I want to show you a timeline, and we'll be able to talk and take some questions off of this one as well. Let's see. Here we go. This is the one. And this is a timeline of the events of the last 200 years that revolve around our views of creation and evolution. So I've gone over who believes what, but we haven't talked at all about kind of how we got there. So in very brief sketch, I'm going to walk through this thing. Normally this is several slides that all just kind of fuzz in as we go, but based on time, I'm just going to run through this kind of quickly. If we think about before the 1800s, the general perspective of pretty much everybody in the Western world was that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. That's why he's sitting there with the Ten Commandments. Sorry, it's not Charlton Heston, but looks pretty similar. And everybody believed that Adam was a historic individual, the first human being that God made. This was the perspective of Christendom and had been for centuries. However, by the time we get to about 1800, there had been rumblings in the century before and now outright writings that called into question the interpretation of those days of Genesis as being literal days. And for the very first time, you had day age, and I should have had gap theory over there as well, with a little symbol from the old Gap company. But anyway, day age and gap theory were both introduced in written form in 1802 and 1807 as a way to try to harmonize what seemed to be evidence for a deep age to the earth in geology with a robust reading of Genesis. Gap theory maintained 6 days of creation and just said that there are new days after God had made other stuff but destroyed it. The old earth, the day age view said that each of the days should be literally understood as an age or a period of creation. So they said that actually day is intended to mean a long period of time. But everybody still agreed that Moses wrote the Pentateuch and Adam was the first man and all that sort of stuff. In the middle 1500s, we had the rise of what was known as higher criticism. This is when, especially in Germany, a group of scholars started reading the Bible initially to try and prove scientifically that it was correct, but what ended up happening is that they started reading the Bible as if it was any other book and teasing it apart and even splitting words within verses and separating them out into different authors and saying that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch was actually written by a variety of different authors over time. They gave them letters J, E, P, and D regarding different sorts of words. J stood for the Yahwehist, the person who used the term Yahweh, which in German is Jehovah. So J. The person who used El and Elohim, that was E. And then we had the priestly writer, that was P. And then D is the Deuteronomist, because Deuteronomy reads different from the rest of the books. Its style and its writing is a little different. It's Moses' commentary on the law. But nonetheless, they said it's an entirely different writer. So they had 4 different writers, plus later people doing edits and whatnot. They tore the Bible into pieces. This did massive damage to Christianity in Europe. Now, on the part of America, we were a little busy in the middle 1600s with a war that was kind of a big deal. And so a lot of this stuff didn't make it over to us until later in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. And that was when we started to lose all of our seminaries that had been started, Harvard, Yale, etc. Now, they had already been lost to Unitarianism, and I can say that growing up in Rhode Island, to Brown University, founded as a Baptist school and eventually became Unitarian and was ripe for takeover by stuff like higher criticism. The fundamentalist revival of the 19-teens and 20s and 30s was an intellectual response to the invasion of higher criticism to our shores. And we use this term fundamentalism now, unfortunately, as a pejorative, but theologically, it was an attempt to return to the fundamentals of Christian faith. That's what fundamentalism was about. What were the fundamentals of the faith? God exists in three persons: the Son, the Father, the Spirit, eternal, together, three in one. That's basic Christianity. That was what was being fought for. That's what fundamentalism actually means, but now it means a lot of other things. That kickback in the fundamentalism period looked for those people who were defending Mosaic authorship in the centuries before, and they looked back and said some of the most conservative writers of the 1800s were day, age, and gap theorists. And that's why when you read the pamphlets that became the fundamentals, the two people who were writing about origins issues, one's a gap theorist, one's a day, age advocate. Those were the views that held the day in conservative circles. Now, in the 1960s, that all changed when Henry Morris and John Whitcomb wrote that book, The Genesis Flood. They swung in with a Louisville Slugger and said, no, that's not the way to read Genesis. That's not the way to understand geology. There's a better way in both. And it started a revival of young earth creation perspective and pulled together Baptist, Lutherans, and Presbyterians, principally, as advocates once again for a young earth creation perspective. They were always around, they were always there, but they had been so academically marginalized. But this galvanized them, brought them back together again. We saw the rise of the Creation Research Society, the founding of the Institute for Creation Research. The 70s and the 80s were a big heyday period for young earth creationism. It was wild. There were debates on college campuses everywhere. You could find Dwayne Gish on any state at any given week. I mean, it's just crazy. But the theologians started getting pretty irritated by the rise of young earth creationism. In the 1970s through the 1990s, there was a lot of fighting within the theology circle about whether or not the young earth creation argument was correct, about whether the days of Genesis really meant 24 hours. And surprisingly, the end result of that is the theologian says, yes, they do. The old age argument that the days could be understood as ages was unsupportable. And you will not find on an evangelical seminary in the United States an Old Testament scholar who's going to say that something like Hugh Ross's day-age view is viable. He has no support for this. That shocked me. Are they all young earth creationists now? No. Most of them aren't. Because what happened in that debate is the debate shifted away from, are the days days? Well, clearly they are. Now the question is, what is Genesis 1 as a document? Is it really history, or is it something else? And if it's something else, then it can use the day as a day and still not mean that we're talking about 6 days of creation. We're talking about a cosmic temple construction by God, or we're talking about an analogy in which God's using a term like day to describe what he's doing, but we can't use it as an actual day. So the theologians, for the most part, did not buy into young earth creationism, even though they agreed that the day term meant what it said. But now the question is Genesis trying to be a historical document or not? And if they say not, then young earth creationists, well, yikes. If Genesis is not being a historical document, then we're entirely wrong. But I don't think we are, because first off, we're still around, as I pointed out to some theologians last year, and they all chuckled in the room. Like, we just don't seem to go away, do we? And that's because we have very solid hermeneutical feet to stand on and a long list of church history. And all these new views that are popping up here, like analogical days or ancient cosmology views of Genesis, are, in my view, only the most recent manifestations of a long line of attempt to kind of get around what Genesis is really doing. Day, age, and gap theory were the attempts of the 1800s, and they survived all the way through the mid and late 1900s, and Hugh Ross's view is still around, but it's not going to be around much longer. It doesn't have a future. framework hypothesis was invented in the 1950s, and it actually has a lot of good things going for them. Young Earth creationists, I think, could learn a lot from framework hypothesis that recognizes that the 3 days of the first days of creation show similarities to what's going on in the second 3 days of creation. But what the framework hypothesis people overreached on is said that this means that it's not history. And I say, no, 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 no. Literary crafting is something that we do with history. So if you look at the first 3 days, when light is created, when the atmosphere is created, and when land and sea are separated, and you see that light is made with the light-bearing bodies on the fourth day, and you see that animals fly in the sky and in the seas below that had been separated, and you see that there are animals on land eating the plants from day 3 and people to rule over them all, you go, okay, actually there is a nice balance and structure. It's imperfect. There are places where this doesn't quite work, which I would expect if this is a literary construction over a historical core. So maybe there's some stuff in there. Maybe we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, but maybe there was too much bathwater and it's not good. Right? So we have to make sure that we are good readers of the text. We should listen to our theologians. We really should. They know the language. They know the context. But we can also still ask them hard questions about, are you coming up with this because you're looking for a way around something? And you want to ask that gently. Because we want Christian charity amongst our brothers and sisters. So these views that we've just gone through with intelligent design and old Earth creation and young Earth creation, they've got a history that goes back a couple hundred years now. And that's one of the reasons why when I talk to folks who I know hold to old Earth and say are a theologian, they're going to say, hey, look, I can point to B.B. Warfield. You don't get more rock-ribbed conservative. You don't get a defender of the inerrancy of Scripture any stronger in the history of the church than B.B. Warfield. And I got to say, you're right. And B.B. Warfield was okay with a limited amount of evolution. And I can say, yes, he was, but he was wrong. And it's okay to say that B.B. Warfield is conservative and incorrect on something. Don't say, if you're a young Earth creationist, don't say B.B. Warfield was a compromiser. That man didn't compromise. He just didn't. He stood in Princeton and held back higher criticism by the sheer weight of his intellect guided by the Spirit. It was impressive. So when we communicate with those who disagree with us in these different views, if we can do that well, if we can treat them with respect and dignity, I think they'll be more open to the arguments that we can present. In my experience, talking with my evolutionary colleagues that I grew up with, that I lived in dorms with, that I lived in apartments with, that I shared offices with, that I worked on projects with. When I did my dissertation, I wasn't there for this. My wife was outside. I was still in the room being grilled by 5 angry men. We had a great time. It was wonderful. But my wife was outside talking to some of the other grad students who had just watched this defense. It was the first time anybody had defended a dissertation for a Ph.D. at the University of Rhode Island in geology. I was the first graduate of the program. And we hadn't had any master's defenses in like 3 years. So like everybody came to watch what one of these things was looking like. The entire department, save one grumpy man, attended the thing. And outside, a couple of my grad student friends were talking to each other, and one of the guys was like, man, every time they had a question, Marcus just pulled up another slide that he hadn't shown, and he brought up the answer, and let me tell you the answer from this slide. He was just like there. And the other guy, also a good friend, looked at him and said, well, what do you expect? Marcus always had a good reason for why he believed what he did. And to this day, I'm still humbled by the fact that he said that. But why could he say that? It's because I tried to excel, and I engaged them with respect and dignity. And did we have some heated conversations? Heck yes, we sure did. But at the end of the day, we also covered each other's classes. I prayed for them. We went out together. We hung around. If I'm to be salt and light, then I got to go find where the salt is needed. So as we dialogue and debate and discuss, you guys have friends, you have family, you have coworkers, you have spouses who may agree or disagree with you. If you can listen to the answers to those questions with charity, to be able to come up with a definition that is accurate for what you're seeing, and you can engage them in a way that says, I understand, I think what you're saying. Ask them, do I get this right? And if they say yes, you've built trust. And you can take that trust and you say, okay, here's how I see it a little bit differently. And here's why. And I think there's some evidence for this. So that is my, not altar call, but that's my encouragement. That this issue of creation and evolution has been with us for a long time. It will be with us for a very long time. And it's easy to feel discouraged, and it's easy to feel downtrodden, and it's easy to feel beaten because young earth creationism, for example, doesn't command the cultural attention that it did even 10 years ago when Ken Ham and Bill Nye had a debate, right? That was big. We're in a period of time right now where things aren't very big. That's okay. It's actually a good period of time for young earth creationism because we can work hard at what we're doing without having distractions from lawsuits and things like that. So as an example, as an example of these sorts of things, I'm just going to leave you with a couple of things about Cornerstone and what I do, and some places that you can find this kind of approach, a newer approach to creationism that I hope is less directly antagonistic, but also more productive as a result. Now, as Heinz mentioned, I run a company called Cornerstone Educational Supply, and my wife likes to call us the stuff people. When your homeschool curriculum says, go get some stuff to do science, that's us. We've got beakers and glassware, we have dead animals, we have rocks and fossils and burners and stuff like that. One of the things that I have here out on the table is this book called Perspectives on the Historical Adam and Eve. I was invited to represent young earth creationism in a multiple views book. And so there's 3 other views in this book that you will not like, probably. And maybe you might be in one of those camps. But if you are, then there's going to be 3 views in this book that you don't like. Mine's going to be one that you don't. But anywhere from Adam was thought to be real, but obviously isn't, so we have to adapt our understanding of the Bible. That's on one end. On my end is Adam is real and the earth is actually young, and there are ways for us to understand geology and anthropology in this way, and it's a deep dive into scripture as well. And in the middle are 2 views that are trying to say we can be inerrantists and we can hold to Adam if we put Adam super deep in time, like 750,000 years ago. Somebody else saying we can keep Adam if he's just one of our great-great-great-grandparents that we all have a genealogical connection to, but God actually used evolution to make humanity, but he made a special person named Adam, and we eventually all kind of connect to him, and that's how salvation can be all in Adam. These are the 2 newest viewpoints that are being put out there by evangelical Christians. The guy saying that Adam is just a myth, he's not an evangelical. But this would be the sort of thing that if you're interested in seeing where the discussions on creation and evolution are right now, the question of is Adam real is the one that the theologians are scared to death about. They really are, because the days of creation and the idea that the earth could be young, they feel they've had some options. But unfortunately, what they've discovered now is that those options are eroding away the possibility of Adam being a real individual. And it's got a lot of people scared. I think actually this is a great opportunity for young earth creationism, because in the next few years, I think young earth creationism is going to be the only position out there holding to an orthodox, conventional, historical Christian perspective on Adam. So we better be ready with something legitimate to hand these folks, or else we'll lose that too. That's not to say to scare you, but to actually say there's a path forward. If you like the idea of young earth creationism having to tackle hard questions, difficult things, and not always knowing if you're going to get an answer, this great book by my friend Todd Wood called The Quest is all about how to approach questions that are hard. There are some questions that are super easy, right? The Bible is filled with 2 sorts of things a lot of times. Things that are so simple a child can understand it. Jesus saves. He does. That is a truth that is so simple everyone can grasp. Then there are mysteries like how does the Trinity work that we will not understand even when we're in heaven. Why? Because when we're in heaven, we ain't God. So you're not going to get an answer to that one. You're only going to be able to look and wonder in awe. But then in the middle in between the things that every child can understand and no one on this earth or in the life after will understand, are the hard questions, the difficult ones. How do we really understand these things? That's what Todd is trying to help us to walk through and understand and give us examples. And if you like fossils, I like fossils a lot. This is a phenomenal book by Paul Garner. He's a geologist and a young earth creationist in the United Kingdom. And he wanted to create a book about fossils and creation that actually loved fossils and didn't look at fossils as just a vehicle to talk about creation. And a lot of times in our writings about stuff, we often use something that we know people like as a hook to talk about the things we want them to hear. Well, Paul is actually saying, you want to learn about fossils? Well, let's learn about fossils. I'm going to put them in a creation context. You're going to learn how they got formed, and you're going to learn how the flood was creating these different layers of rock. But we're also going to have a whole thing on the back that shows you a whole bunch of different fossils and what they're like. And so when you go out collecting and looking for fossils, you'll be able to find out what you have. And it's beautifully illustrated with these watercolors. It makes it feel like you're reading a book from the 80s again, for those of us who liked those things. So with that, I'm so grateful for the time you've given. Sorry, I've gone a little over on this, but thank you very much. It looks like Heinz has got a microphone at the ready.
Okay, well, let's give him a hand for the presentation. He gave you a lot of things to think about. He covered a lot of fields there. But I'm sure that's maybe raised some questions in your mind. So if you have a question, put up your hand, and I'll bring the microphone around so people can hear the question as well as the answer. So yeah, two right here.
Thank you. You didn't have the time, but you could have gone into perhaps talking about the worldview that different adherents of these different positions came from. Mm-hmm. Because these different positions don't just suddenly pop up. There's a worldview or an innate assumption about how the world works that which actually would be grist for another book. Maybe you could write another book talking about how these different individuals, including Darwin and Dawkins and everyone in between, how they came to where they were. So you can't really understand. You want to be collegial in talking with people. It's hard to really grasp that, I think, without understanding where the different positions originate. So
I think that's a good point. Yeah, and again, that comes from listening and understanding well. If you read Dawkins, it doesn't take very long to come out, with an understanding of what his worldview is, for example, or Stephen Gould when he said, religion and science are non-overlapping magisteria, right? That's the science non-science demarcation. This religious stuff is not science, right? So okay, you're going after that. So yeah, worldviews are very important. On the other hand, let me just say this too: worldviews are adaptive, can be challenged, right? We all think that worldviews can be challenged, but also our own worldview can be challenged. And where did these different perspectives come up, and what were the conditions that drew them? For things like gap theory and day age, those grew up out of a Christianized scientific community, where they were seeing evidence for what they thought was a significant amount of time, and they didn't know what to do with it, right? They were looking at these stacks of rock, and they're looking at these erosion features and cobbles from one rock that are in another one, and going, well, that must have been solid rock in order to be included into it, but the flood, I just envision lots of mud everywhere, and how would this happen? Some people, not Christians, looking at that and saying, see, look, there's evidence that the Bible is, not correct. So yes, exploring what somebody's worldview is going to be very helpful in knowing how you're going to be able to talk to them. I doubt Dawkins and I would be able to have much of a cordial conversation, just because he's not that nice of a guy. And that's all right. I'm not called to talk to everybody. But for those who are willing to chat, I'll lend an ear and see if they'll be willing to do likewise.
Okay, question.
The last book you showed up there,
yes.
Fossils and the Flood. Can you tell me when that was published?
Yes.
Does it have in there about soft tissue and fossils are supposed to be 60 million years old?
Good question. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure, yes. Paul does talk about that. The book was published about 3 years ago, I think, about 2020, give or take, on that. It took a little while for it to get published, but eventually did. And we carry it. It's also available through isgenesishistory.com. So those of you who remember that documentary, they had another documentary that came out last year, and Compass Cinema also publishes a number of creation books, including The Quest and this one. So yes, those would be discussed in the book. And really, really great descriptions of life in the pre-flood world and what that must have been in order to produce the fossil record that we see in the world around us.
When you were speaking on the chart that you came up with, you said there were certain questions that you asked to come up with that. I don't remember if you showed that slide or not, but could you tell us what some of those questions are?
Sure. Let me just pull up that illustration so that, because they're kind of embedded in that, but no, I didn't show kind of the chart that I did. All right, here we go.
I think you showed 4 questions, but not all of them.
Not all of them. So as I go up the chart, I'll be able to tell you what each of those were, because they form this lower bound to it. So the first question was about the organization of life, and that is, does life have a design to it? Does the universe have a design to it, a purpose, or not? That's that first node up from there where it says design or telos. So anybody who says, yes, there is a design to the world, some purpose to it, is going to be in this group, and those who say no are on the materialist side. So the first question is design, yes or no? The second question is that design detectable using the means of science? And so splitting out from the next one, you have the detectable, and that is where intelligent design would sit. Everybody from that point upward could be part of an intelligent design position in a general sense. They might not be members of the Discovery Institute or what have you, but they all are design advocates, whereas those who say no, that's the group that says undetectable. So that might be the Catholic biochemist who says, I believe that God created the world, but I don't believe science can tell us anything about when or how or what was going on. The next one is, what is the nature of the designer? Is the designer, if you believe there is one, is it a physical entity within the universe, or is it something that is non-physical? So corporeal or non-corporeal are the terms for that. Corporeal meaning having a body. After that, if you think that it's non-corporeal, is the deity transcendent? If you answer yes to that, is it deistic or theistic? Right? Because deistic and theistic versions of God are very similar, but very distinct at the same time. Right? Is the God continuing to work within the world, or is it Isaac Newton's watchmaker that just sets it off and spins the top and lets it run? If the deity is theistic, did they create using an evolutionary process where all of life is connected, or did they create life by separate entities, groups, kinds of some sort? And so you can say yes or no on that. Do you believe in universal ancestry or separate ancestries? And then the very last question would be, how old do you think the Earth is? Do you think the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, or do you think that it's some thousands of years old? And obviously, everybody is going to answer no to that, except for the young Earth creationists. So as I coded this out, it was a big grid with ones and zeros. Ones were yeses, and zeros were nos, and X's were like if that question just doesn't apply, answering questions. So those would be the questions that were generating this graph. You're welcome. Thanks for the question.
Okay, time for one more question. Yeah.
How did you come to your worldview perspective? Just a question.
So how did I become a young Earth creationist? That's a great question, and it's obviously a very personal one, but I remember very distinct. I grew up in a spiritually mixed household. My mother became a born-again believer probably when I was about 3 or 4. My father is, to this day, still an agnostic. An agnostic in the sense that he does believe something created this world, but he doesn't believe that we can know it and that it might even understand or know what's happening here, right? It could be just some science experiment in a petri dish type of thing. So it's interesting because my sister said my dad might be the only person in the world who's a young earth creationist agnostic, because he's pretty convinced that we're right about this. So I came to love dinosaurs when I was 4. I learned about them for the first time when I was 4, and they just blew my mind. And I wanted to become a paleontologist. By the time I was 7, I learned that word. But I also grew up in a very conservative Christian church. My mom took my sister and I to church every Sunday, and we were in a very strong fundamental Baptist church. And it didn't take too long. By the time I was about 9, I remember distinctly sitting in our playroom. It's a little tiny, like 8 by 10, or not even 8 by 10, it was like 6 by 10 room. It was like a modified closet with our toys in it. And I remember thinking to myself, wait a minute, my dinosaur books are talking about dinosaurs living millions of years ago. And the Bible seems to be talking about God creating in 6 days, and it doesn't seem to be like long. It seems to be short. How does that work? Right? And in my 9-year-old mind, I actually started going through these options. I didn't have the theological knowledge, I didn't have the terminology, but I distinctly remember thinking a couple of options. Did God create things before the creation week? Did he create dinosaurs millions of years ago, and then later he made like man and things? I was thinking a kiddie version of the gap theory. I didn't know that word, I didn't know that term, but it popped up as an option, right? It's just, you're thinking, how do you do this? And or maybe God didn't mean days. I was thinking something like maybe it was a day age kind of thing. And I didn't know this terminology. I didn't know that this view was 200 years old. And as I continued thinking about it, I was like, it doesn't seem like God was talking about long periods of time, because why would he use a word like day? Like this, there's better words. There's got to be better words for that, like age, year, lots, whatever, time. And so I became pretty convinced that the Bible's description was that of a young earth. And the Bible was written with God, and my dinosaur books weren't. And as silly a bit as that sounds, it actually kind of was part of the logic. It was, this is the inspired word of God, and this isn't. So these guys must be mistaken somehow. And so that set me on a trajectory of thinking about it. Now, somebody listening to me uncharitably would say, oh, he decided when he was 9 years old, and he was determined ever since. Believe me, I've considered and reconsidered and considered and considered and reconsidered whether or not I think I'm right about this. Because if you're going to stand in front of an audience like this and say, I think this is the truth, you got to look at all these other options out there and see, am I mistaken? And when I was working on this book on Adam, I was very worried when I first started cracking open commentaries on the Bible written by people who really understand these languages and what the Bible is trying to do. I was really worried that my view on young earth creationism was infantile, that it was simplistic, and that it was going to melt in the face of good Hebrew scholarship. And that was already after I had read lots of other perspectives out there. I wasn't impressed by them, but I was going in to read the theologians, and I was honestly very surprised at how robust young earth creationism came out of that. This was just 4 years ago that I was involved in this project. And I went, it's way better than I even knew. And now that I'm in the weeds on these things, and I'm learning about the Hebrew of what's being talked about, and I learn about the allusions and the use of Adam elsewhere in Scripture, read Genesis 1 and 8 together. Wow, it's amazing. Homework assignment. Read Genesis 1, Genesis 8, pull them up together, read them through, look for similarities. It's wild. Seeing how the Bible uses those things over and over again, reinforces their historicity. I went, yeah. I came out of this more convinced than ever after reading people who disagree with this, who have the Hebrew chops to make solid arguments, and go, I can actually see where you took a left turn at Albuquerque to get where you are. Because if you actually followed your logic, you'd end up actually right here. But you kind of skipped over this way because you needed this result. or you thought you had an out, but actually I've got a good answer for that one. I can conceive of, and unfortunately a lot of times in young earth creationism we don't see those things written about because we're not working at that level. We're not communicating at that level. And we need more people who can. We need people to talk at the lay level to everybody who can understand this stuff. But we also need to protect our flank because we left our theological friends out in the wind and we didn't engage with them. And as a result, they're open to perspectives that I think are very damaging to later aspects of Christian doctrine. So that's a little bit about kind of where I came from and how I got here. Thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Hans.
And
appreciate it very much.
And actually, that's a very good lead-in to tomorrow, because that's exactly what he's going to be talking about tomorrow morning at the mini-conference on Adam and the origin of humans. And then in the evening at the youth night out, he's going to be speaking about worldview. You know, what does a worldview mean? What world do you have, and does what you believe match what we see, match reality? So perfect lead-in. So come on out tomorrow to one or both of those events. So just to wrap up, next month we're going to have Eric Hovind here. And he's been involved in apologetics for a long time, almost 20 years, I think. He sort of grew into that role. And we look forward to having him come here. He's going to be speaking again for 5 days, and different churches and schools. And one of the talks he's going to do, and that'll be here on the Friday night, is called The Mind of the Skeptic. How do we deal with skeptics? You know, they have questions. How do we answer those questions they have? Because they're legitimate questions to have. And even as a Christian, you can have doubts, but there are answers. So he's going to speak on that topic. Evidence for the truth of the Bible be one of those, and a bunch of others. If you go to our website, apologeticsforum.org, and you'll see their upcoming events under their upcoming apologetics meetings. You'll see all the talk he's going to give and when. And there's also a flyer on the back table that has a description of his talk, and also all the other talks he's going to do are listed in that, so take advantage of that. So to wrap up, just to remind you that there are book tables for the Apologetics Forum. We've got about 4 or 5 tables set up there with the books and DVDs. And there's, of course, our speaker, Marcus's table on the back against the windows there. You can go visit and see what he's got in the way of fossils and minerals and other things like that, and the 3 books that he mentioned. One of the books which he will describe, I'm sure, in more detail tomorrow morning. So, and if you want to sign up to get on our mailing list, there's a sign-up sheet on the back as well, and other resources available on our website. And if you want to contribute to this ministry, we bring in speakers. We also bring speakers into the Christian schools. And if you want to support that, there are 2 donation boxes on the back row there. Or you can also go to our website, hit donate, and use PayPal or credit card, whatever, to contribute. So anyway, that's what we have. Let me close in prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Father, we thank you for this time. We thank you for Marcus's ministry. Thank you for all the things that he's covered here just this evening. Given us many things to think about. And Lord, you've given us answers as we study your nature, as we study your creation. And we have many creation scientists that have done research and reported on that and have answered many questions for us. We thank you for that. Pray that you continue to use Marcus in his ministry, and specifically the next 2 days as we have him here. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.